That's what we're looking for. It's not the event itself. Like you just said, it's a tool. And if we can use the tools, I mean, God is the one that's going to impact hearts and change minds.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Intentional Churches podcast. And remember, we're always here to give you practical wisdom and insight into leading your church and really aligning you, your teams, and your people to the Great Commission. We've got an incredible conversation today. I can't wait to get into it. Before we get there, I'm really excited to tell you guys, our podcast listeners, about something that the IC team has been working on for quite a while. We've invested several years over thinking through this, and we're ready to reveal it to you guys as a kind of part of the next piloting group. And it's called the Intentional Churches Community. It's a free-to-join online community platform that's designed to foster individual growth of you as a church leader while nurturing a collective wisdom and best practice from church leaders like yourself from all across the country. You can get started with your free account at intentionalchurches.com/community. But today, we've got an incredible conversation. I'm joined by Juan Carlos Heredia. And Juan Carlos, thank you for joining us. I've heard so much about you over the years from our friend Ben Coleman. But for our listeners and our audience, can you give us an overview of you? Because you've got quite a unique story before we dive into kind of talking about where you minister. So tell us about you and your story.
Well, thank you, Doug, for having me on this podcast and also for the Intentional Church Ministry. It's been just a blessing for me personally and for our church as well. So I am originally from Quito, the capital city of Ecuador. I was born there, but when I was about a year old, moved to Los Angeles, California, lived there for about 12 years. My dad is from Ecuador. He's a lawyer, actually, from Ecuador, and studied at UCLA. So we were there for that period of time. Married my mom. My mom is from Mexico. Unfortunately, we were brought up in a little bit of a toxic, broken home. And so there was some separation there and some family issues that moved us around. So we actually moved back to Ecuador, and my parents ended up separating. And we moved to Mexico, where we lived for a few years. And throughout that whole process, even though it was difficult, God used that in an incredible way for us to come to faith. And my mom was actually the first one that became a Christian. And seeing that, I became a Christian when I was 12. My siblings as well. I have an older brother, younger sister. And when I was 15, felt a call for ministry. I didn't exactly know what that meant. I was in Mexico, thought that I needed to pursue law, just like my dad. My grandfather had been a judge, so thought that kind of that was the family business. And but I couldn't shake the calling. Went try to do other things, and over time, just God pressed on my heart that was what He wanted for my life. Met the ideal pastor's wife at church, and so we decided that if this was my call, this is what God was wanting me to do, then I needed seminary training. And so through a spiritual father who had been a lead pastor here at a church in Houston, moved to Texas, went to seminary, got education, and over that period, God allowed me to do several things over time: bivocational ministry, student pastor, church planner, and now lead pastor at a small Hispanic church, and now serving at a mega church, founding and starting a Spanish ministry here.
Yeah, that's great, Juan Carlos. What an incredible story. And, some of our listeners know mine, but I can really identify with that kind of tumultuous home life in childhood and coming to Christ miraculously as a teenager, and how Jesus did that. So thank you for sharing that. So you referenced this already. You're in Houston, Texas. And for many of our listeners, they may not be that aware of Houston, Texas. Can you just kind of give us some context about the city first off? I think it's been called the most diverse city in America, but you tell us, you live there. So tell our listeners about Houston.
Yeah, it's hard to believe that Houston surpassed New York and Los Angeles when it comes to diversity a few years ago. It is just an incredible city where you could see 145 languages or people, different countries and languages are spoken here in the city of Houston. So you see people from basically all over the world. I heard someone say that Houston is probably the key to reaching the world in the 21st century, and I believe it. When you come to the city, it is a mission field, and so there's the city is spread out. So it's the fourth largest city in the country. So reaching people from different parts has its challenges, but so many different opportunities. And this city is full of mosques. It's full of Buddhist temples and centers. We have, I think, the second largest Hindu temple in the nation. So you see that religious diversity all over the place, and as well as ethnic diversity. And so it is a very, very different city than what you normally see across the country.
Well, I get the privilege to work a lot with one of our partner churches in Orlando in Central Florida, and it's really changed and become a diverse area. And I feel like I'm going to school a little bit there, but I want to explore a little more because that sounds. I think you said 145 different languages or different
That's right.
people group. I, so tell me how the city's set up a little bit. Like I live in Las Vegas, and by and large, in Las Vegas, it's a pretty integrated city. There is a more Hispanic kind of few neighborhoods, and there is a traditional, more black kind of African American neighborhood, but those are pretty small. It's pretty.
Yeah.
Is Houston like that more, where there's a lot of integration, or are there pockets of those 145 different groups?
So it's more towards the integration. That's what I think there's a big difference. Like, for example, if you go up north to Dallas, you see it a lot more segregated among the different groups, but Houston has a lot more integration among the different minority groups and ethnic groups. And you are going to find certain areas where predominantly there'll be a certain ethnicity, but in general, you go to any neighborhood and you're going to find Black, white, Hispanic, Asian, and all of them living pretty much in the same neighborhood. Now, according to the demographics, the largest ethnic group that we have in Houston is the Hispanic population. But it's kind of also not over dominating, but you see similar percentages with black and white as well. Asian is the one that's a little bit far behind, but it's actually growing, especially with people moving in from India.
Okay. And I do want to back up in your story a little bit. Were you you said you were pastor of a Spanish speaking church in Houston, of a smaller church? Yeah.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
tell us a
Mhm.
little bit, and what years was that? And tell us a little bit about that context, because a lot of our listeners, as you know, and we don't need to get into all the stats, but in America, figuring out how do we build our churches in a way that are welcoming and inviting in for those who are of Hispanic heritage is a really critical part of the future of the church in America. So I want you to talk about first that before we get into talking about Sugar Creek and your role there. So talk about what years you were there and a little bit about that ministry. And was it like first generation or mixed, or, give us some a little context.
Sure. Yeah. I think that, well, first of all, that was now about 19 years ago that I was pastoring that small church. I was with that church for about close to 7 years, pastoring as lead pastor. A friend of mine had founded the church, and after he left, he asked if I could come on board and lead the church, and so I did that. Just a great small church. When I got there, probably about 60 people. When I ended up leaving, we were about 150. So it had grown in that period, and the church consisted mostly of immigrants and first generation born Hispanics. And
learning English as a second language while they're here?
Yes, yeah. Most, I would say probably the immigrant population had found pockets in the city where they were able to carry out work in Spanish. So they were not really forced to necessarily assimilate in that respect. But that next generation was definitely bilingual. In fact, I would say that it mostly tended towards English more than Spanish. And there were, and just like any minority that moves into a different country, obviously here in the States, that first generation born is kind of caught in the middle where they don't really know where they're from. They're um, the kind of the expectations of the parents are put on them, that parents want them to be culturally assimilated to their home country, but at the same time, they're hanging out with their English speaking friends, they're watching TV in English, they're going to school in English, so they're having that difficulty of not really knowing who they are. There, I think there's an identity crisis with that first generation. It's the second generation that there's a lot more clarity, and that's where they feel more American. And that, in fact, I see as the biggest challenge with any Hispanic church, especially if it's a Spanish speaking church and it's predominantly an immigrant class. It's retaining the first generation and on. What tends to happen with these churches is that they tend to not grow because once the kids go off to college, when they come back, they end up looking for a church that speaks more to their language than their parents.
Man, Juan Carlos, super helpful context for a lot of our listeners. Super helpful. And I do want to sit on this because with intentional churches, we really have raised this value of personal ownership of the Great Commission. So, did you see in that church and in your people, was there an ownership of the Great Commission? Like, were people active in relational evangelism who were first generation? I think when we get over to talk about your work at Sugar Creek, we're going to talk about second, third generation assimilation, all that. But the first generation, for our listeners who are thinking, can we help our first generation immigrants be active in the Great Commission with other Spanish speakers? Did you find that to be true? Would people do that?
So the Hispanic community is in itself pretty gregarious. They're very relational. So I think that comes naturally to the culture. But when I got to the church, there wasn't that evangelistic discipleship mindset. It was a little more insulated. I think that is the tendency of probably the majority of churches in America. And so part of what we had to do was change the mindset. But it wasn't that difficult because it was already built into the culture. So once people started experiencing the joy of bringing others to Christ, it kind of caught on with the rest of the church. And so it started to become a little bit of our culture. It was something that was celebrated. It was something that was being led from the front. All of us, including myself and my family, we were all trying to model that, and that just continued to build that culture of invitation and of evangelism and discipleship.
Isn't that amazing, Juan Carlos? I mean, it's just the older I get, that the gospel really does these things we're trying to teach, these back to basics things transcend. They transcend language, culture, and everything else. Like if you're doing it as the leader and you're exemplifying it and calling people to do it, and they get a taste of what it's like, no matter what your background is, to share Christ. And as a believer, what a deeply shaping and fulfilling discipling mechanism that is when I'm actually reaching people for Christ, that's more filling than just consuming Bible study after Bible study, which are great. But you know what I'm saying? When you're active with your faith, isn't it amazing that it transcends? It
It
doesn't
is.
matter.
It is, Doug. I fully agree with that. And I resonated with a lot of the principles that you taught us here at Sugar Creek as well. And one of the things, I think the key factor in order to transform a church in this respect is leadership. Leaders have to model this. We can't simply try to create a evangelism program, a missions program, but they have to see the leadership modeling this as well in order for this to take off.
Let's fast forward to Sugar Creek. So you talk about, number one, Sugar Creek, just a little bit of contextual, and then specifically about, do you call it a campus or a ministry? How do you guys term it?
Right. So the Spanish ministry is kind of a different animal. It's kind of a weird thing because we're not really a campus and we're not like fully a ministry. We're called Spanish ministry, but we're integrated into 2 of our 3 campuses. Well, I should say 3 of our 4 because online is a ministry as well, and it's in the process, I think, of becoming a campus as well. And there's already plans for at our other campus for Spanish to have a presence as well. So the idea behind this model was something that when I came 18, almost 19 years ago, it wasn't something that you could find in most churches. And that was the idea of a full integration of a Spanish ministry into the church. And the reason why I was bought into that vision when I was invited to come on staff here at Sugar Creek is because I was already seeing the challenges at the previous church, and that was affecting our ability to grow, to reach other people. We were not retaining that younger generation, and this model actually allowed Hispanic families that were made up of Spanish speakers, English speakers, and the cultural differences to still be taken into consideration and have the family under the same roof at the same church, grow together, and continue to reach people without language or culture being an obstacle.
Oh, that's great. And then I don't know if you have a relationship, but with Pastor Israel Martin at First Baptist Orlando. But if not, I have to introduce you guys. And I just had a meeting a couple of weeks ago with 5 or 6 Spanish-speaking pastors in Central Florida, and it was so enlightening. I just feel so ignorant, and I think a lot of our listeners who come from a suburban white context more, or maybe even metropolitan don't get some of this nuance that's behind the scenes. And this, I would start to call it emerging model that you guys are give us a great example of it, Sugar Creek, and then I would argue at First Orlando and Mosaic Church in Orlando, Florida. So I want to go down this road and talk about it, and then also talking about reaching people. So I think my question would be, I hear you kind of getting there around, hey, I did Spanish speaking, kind of more first gen, and like you're seeing my friend Eduardo, who's the Mosaic Espanol pastor, said, my kids barely speak any Spanish. He goes, and I'm from Puerto Rico, man. and he said, so a lot of the immigrant population is really seeing this idea of assimilation into. So I want you to, if you would, talk from more a Hispanic church leaders' perspective of that importance, value to a Hispanic family of assimilation of the next generations. But I'm going to warn you in advance, I'm going to come back because he said something that was very convicting. He's like, the suburban church that has all the money and resources wants to almost cram down our throat. He didn't say it that harshly, but that's what I read. Like
Right.
a white suburban way of doing things. So we'll do that later. But first, talk about like how you're thinking about the assimilation and how that immigrant family and now the next generations are wanting to experience the church, Christ, and then eventually we'll get into talk about being on mission. So,
Well, I think culture is the determining factor for all of us. There's a white culture, there's a Hispanic culture, Black culture. So it's something that's just imprinted in all of us, and a lot of times that's ignored. And it's almost as though instinctively all of us normalize our culture. We think that that's the standard by which we measure everyone else. It's just human nature. We all do that. And when we do that, we create blind spots to reach other cultures. And I'm reminded of, I don't know if you've read the book, um, reading scripture through Western eyes. But it's a fabulous book, and what it talks about there is the idea of how even the way that we read scripture, we have these cultural lenses by which we interpret scripture. And one example that's stuck with me was the prodigal son parable. And there was a professor in seminary that gave an assignment where they were to read the passage and they were to retell the passage. And he had people from different countries do this. And he noticed that people, for example, in the US, they had missed a critical factor that other countries they highlighted. And that was that in Luke 15:14, it talks that the famine was the trigger for the prodigal son to actually go back to his father. But none of the people from America even mentioned the famine because it wasn't something in the culture. But for people in Africa, for people in other countries that had been hit by famines, it was a determining factor. I think the same thing happens with all of us. And so when when you try to create a church that's made up of two different cultures, that has to be taken into consideration, and not from the perspective that one is the normal and the other is kind of, we're going to assimilate you into it. But it's the idea that every culture has redeeming factors, has good things that we can learn from. And that's part of what the new heavens and new earth is going to be in the future. So the church should be modeling that. So when it comes to the Hispanic church, relationships trump everything. That is the number one thing. And programs and ministries and things have to be created along that mindset. And probably in the white suburban church, it's more the operations, it's more the logistics, and it's not so much the relationships as much as we'll create these programs and people will flock towards that. In the Hispanic culture, it's more you create the relationship and then you create all of these other things, and people are going to come to that.
Fascinating. And I would say my read on the white culture, I appreciate what you're saying about programs and operations. I think that's very true, is the individualized, because like you're talking about the prodigal son, most Westerners read that through the lens of a personalized experience of a family member themselves, and it's really, I don't know, kind of a self-centered viewpoint. And what I'm appreciating, the more and more work we're doing with Hispanic churches and leaders and everything else, is what you're saying about relationship, because I believe the white suburban church has a lot to learn about it. I've been astounded by that linkage of relationship, how deep it runs. And because of that, how much further in ministry strategies oftentimes people can get, because we're not siloed off and individual thinking by departments and everything else like the white suburban church. And I know that suburban, I don't even know if it's really the white suburban church anymore. It's kind of the Western suburban church, because it's probably goes beyond ethnic background and really mindset. So tell me then, practically, let's get into, when you're talking about that, the cultural imprint, which I really, that is really enlightening for me. The cultural imprint of the mindsets we come with the Western mind and the Hispanic mind, as the assimilation together, not one dominating, is happening and going to have to happen over the next 10, 20, 30 years in the American church. Practically, what does that look like from your viewpoint? Because you're kind of living in both worlds, right? What are some practical things? Like at First Orlando, one of their big ahas early on was they now have signage across their campus in Spanish and Portuguese. They only had English when they started when they had a pretty large Spanish speaking, they call it a campus, but it's like you said, like so what are practical examples that our church leaders could take from you to say, don't be the Western suburban culture dictating, but what does the assimilated look like? Do you have thoughts around that? Practical ideas?
Yeah, when I go back to the leadership factor. If churches are looking to do something like this, where it's not only with Hispanics, it's going to be with any other group, you have to find leaders that understand both cultures. I think that's one of the main factors because it's not going to be a cookie cutter type of approach, but it's almost you have to experiment through certain things and see what works. Um, Even here at Sugar Creek, when we started our Spanish service at our second campus, I noticed that some of the things that we had done here with our original Spanish congregation were not working out there, and that was just 20 minutes away from this campus. So there's not so much a formula towards it. It's a lot of experiencing, experimenting, being out there in the trenches with people, and obviously trying out things and correcting and refining along the way. But the other thing that I remind our leadership here at Sugar Creek is that the reason why Spanish exists is because we're here to supplement rather than try to create a different thing. The old mindset was if you created a different ethnic church, it was kind of a mission. So it was set aside. So you guys do your things. You could meet on our facilities, but you do your own thing. You have your own identity, and we'll have our identity. But from the beginning, we embraced the same vision, the same mission. Those were kind of the big building blocks that united all of us. So we're going to do the same things. We're going to unite the same sermon series. Um, Pastor Mark Hartman, who is our lead pastor, just an incredible leader and humble because he allowed me, a younger pastor, to come in and preach and start a congregation without him having that direct voice that any lead pastor wants. And so that trust just humbled me and honored me. And so I communicate, I'm kind of Pastor Mark's voice in Spanish. And the reason why we did this as well is because video services and video sermons don't work in the Hispanic church. I looked all over the place to see if there was a thriving church that was doing that. I could not find one. Again, we go back to relationships. They need to see someone on stage that they could connect to. So it just made sense that we had to go in that direction. But what I preach and the way that we tailor the entire Spanish ministry is a reflection of the values and of the mission and the goals that we have as a church overall. Now, the other thing is that even though we mirror those things, we also have a degree of flexibility because it's not going to be able to mirror the exact same things, and so you have to adapt it according to the needs. And so we have some other things again supplementing what the Hispanic congregation needs versus the English congregation. But then here's the other factor because our kids speak English, there's no reason to create a separate Spanish uh, student ministry or a Spanish kids ministry. They're all integrated. And that's already happening at school. So it's not like we're creating, something new. We're not creating the wheel all over again. Our kids are much better at integrating and adapting than adults. So what we supplement is more the adults who are that immigrant or some first generation, but then second generation and forward, they go to the English services. They're part of serving, they're part of everything else that the church is doing, and we're all together.
Again, this conversation is fascinating to me, Juan Carlos, because I do believe we are having a forward, futuristic looking conversation right now about what church leadership needs to be. And the way you're even talking about the practicality of contextualization appropriately, and that the church trying to catch up with what's already happening in most of our schools.
Right.
Throughout America, it almost doesn't matter what community you live in. I don't know if assimilation is the right word, integration. I don't know what the right word is, but it's like you talked about, the coming together of cultures.
Right. It's almost like a partnership is probably the closest we can come up with.
Yeah, like, and the shifting of, like, because my kid, I have a high schooler and a college kid, and they've grown up in an incredibly partnered set of cultures where they have cultural understandings I don't have because they just lived it. It was natural. Yeah. So let me ask about, like, how have you, in the Sugar Creek context, in this ministry slash campus slash partnership, how have you seen people really own the Great Commission personally? How have you been able to get them? And then could you give a story of maybe a congregant who is in the ministry who is really owning relational evangelism and how they're going about doing that and seeing it in their life?
Well, I do believe in the old and tried culture of invitation. I think that there is something to be said about it. And again, it's a reflection of the leadership. So, one of the things that we celebrate and we try here at Sugar Creek, and something that we do in the Spanish ministry as well, is that we try to create opportunities that are gospel focused so that can take the baby step. If we ask them to go and share their, the gospel, they're going to feel intimidated. But what if their first step is simply, hey, come with me to church and I'll take you to lunch afterwards? It's a simple baby step that anyone can do. And our promise is that we will create a service or an event that will be focused on reaching the one. And in fact, tonight we have an example of that. We have a big Valentine's dinner, and we will be serving 300 people, 150 couples. Of them, between 40 to almost 50% are people that have never been in a church. They're being
Yes.
invited by someone in the congregation. And in
Yes.
fact, on Wednesday, I was talking to someone who's struggling in his marriage. His wife is not coming to church yet. He's committed and everything to following Christ. We're praying for him and everything. But he said, "Hey, by the way, I bought a ticket for a couple of friends. They'll be there on Friday."
Isn't that
So
amazing? It's so
and
good to
and
me.
it's excellent. And so the philosophy behind even these events, or the way that we tailor this, is that we want to start where people are at, not where we're at, right? Kind of following what the Apostle Paul says in 1 Corinthians 9 about becoming a Jew to the Jew, becoming uh, um, towards the Gentiles, meeting people where they're at rather than where we're at. So we're actually using the theme of up as a couples event, and that's on the tickets. That's the only thing that we're promoting. Last year we used Star Wars, so we're using things from the culture that people can connect to. But this is our opportunity that once they're here, we do something with very high excellence. It opens up their hearts so that they can hear the gospel. So those are things that we challenge people to say, hey, who are you going to invite? Who are you going to reach? Who are you going to bring? Who are you praying for? Who are you discipling? And that's something that's constantly communicated from the stage and all over the place.
That's great, man. Help me first, though. Star Wars for a Valentine's thing? How did
I
that
know.
work?
What could be more romantic than Star Wars, right?
Not for
Well,
my wife.
yeah, it actually turned out to be a very, very successful event. We focus more on the romantic part of Han and Leia. But the thing is, for Valentine's dinner, here's one of the challenges. Women are more open to coming, men are not. So Star Wars was our way of getting the guys to be interested in it. And once they were here, we were able to hook them.
That's awesome. That is awesome because what I want our listeners to hear is the thoughtfulness. And I want to challenge because this is, I'm sure you've been a part of the American church for a long time, man. We chase the programmatic idea as if the Valentine's banquet is what would win and grow people and people intuitively and by osmosis know to invite. It's not the event. Like, this is the dark secret of the last 40 years of church growth. It wasn't the model. it was what I'm hearing, it's what you're modeling and teaching again and again about the invite, and this is only a tool we're giving you as a believer. Even if your marriage is having some issues, you can still be on mission while you're figuring that out, which to me, Juan Carlos, is a beautiful expression of the ministry of Jesus. People were, the disciples were all jacked up while they were going about doing the work of evangelism along the way. So,
That's right. And it's the intentionality behind it. And so one of the things you can have people be invited to church, but people need to be with them in the process, in the discipleship process. Otherwise, they're not going to stay, right? They get invitations through the mail, online, but if they don't have a connection, the idea that they're going to stay just because of a sermon or because of a ministry or because we had great childcare or something like that is little to none. And so part of the challenge is whoever you invite, you're responsible for. So it's the idea that you're going to sit with them, you're going to help them, you're going to help them connect. And so even this event that I'm talking about, 3 years ago, we had a couple. Their name is Omar and Anna. We've had them on video. We've had them share their testimony. They were invited by one of our deacons. They got the tickets. They just recently told me the entire story, so I didn't know all the details. And so they were invited. Their marriage was on the verge of collapse. They were about to get a divorce, had three sons, and it was something terrible that they were going through. They came to the banquet 3 years ago, and God used it to shake up their marriage. They came to faith. They made a profession of faith. They got connected through their friends. They were walked through a foundations class that we have, and then now last year they've been part of mission trips that they're leading. They're serving in our congregation. A couple of years ago, the husband helped us build one of the sets for one of our events. And so that's what we're looking for. It's not the event itself. Like you just said, it's a tool. And if we can use the tools, I mean, God is the one that's going to impact hearts and change minds.
yeah, that's great. Incredible. So, Juan Carlos, I know it's a heavier ask, but I always like to ask our guests to kind of give a, hey, you've got the ear of however many church leaders going to listen to this episode. And what is a challenge or thought you would give, couple few sentences to these church leaders? And I'm going to leave it wide open. Like, if you want to give it around what you think the future of the church in America needs to be thinking about around partnership between cultures or evangelism, or what would you want to say to a bunch of church leaders if you've not maybe ever had that chance to do through this medium? What would you want to say?
I think one of the biggest challenges we have is although I've talked about the culture and all that, I believe that's an incredible opportunity that we have across America. I think this country is so great. I pray and I love America and I love the opportunities that we have that we could be a mission field. But if there's something that I think that we need to continue to focus on is the number of kids that are abandoning their faith by the time they reach college. Last year alone, the number of young people that I had to counsel because their parents were worried that they had been brought up in the church, they had heard the Sunday school lessons, they had heard the sermons, they had heard the worship, and yet when their faith was challenged in college, the whole thing fell apart. And so several of them had questions um, on why does God allow evil? Why do these things happen? What answers do we have for the challenges against Scripture? And so my concern is that as we build up churches that are strong in the gospel, that we're being evangelistic, that we also close the back door by giving them the apologetical tools that they can defend their faith. And so that we have those conversations where kids can ask the tough questions. And even when we don't have the answer, we could still say that we can trust God even in those things. So if there's something that I would love for us as leaders to do is close the back door towards the younger generations that are through social media, through TV, through college, through school, through friends, the faith is sometimes being rocked, and the church has to be the place where we provide those answers.
That's super wise. Thank you for sharing that. Thank you very much. Juan Carlos, it's been a great conversation. I've appreciated, especially I've learned a ton about, the cultural imprints on all of us and how we even approach scripture. I've loved talking about, what the future of the church in America is wrestling with right now, but is going to have to wrestle with for a long time. How do we partner together as cultures and really keep the main thing, the Great Commission being owned personally? I loved, again, if you've been around IC for any amount of time, that leaders must go first. We should all be owning this. These are all been great, and even the practical examples, but especially as a father of a college student and a high school student, your challenge to us as leaders: how do we close this back door, and what is it that we need to be doing for these future generations to make sure their faith is more solid? Um, I have a hunch some of it is around this relational evangelism piece, like calling our kids into mission even when they're a kid. But
Yes.
I think that is just rich, rich, rich. So Juan Carlos, thank you for taking time to converse with us and our audience. And yeah, man, thank you. So, to our listeners, thanks for listening to the Intentional Churches podcast. And of course, I'm going to ask you for a shameless plug. If this has been helpful to you, please leave us a rating and review wherever you listen to your podcast. This helps all the leaders in this network of churches to grow together, because we believe that church leaders are better together when we're sharing and collaborating. And remember, the Intentional Churches Conference is coming up in April, the 29th and 30th. Join us together with a community of church leaders who committed to bringing radical alignment, which I can't wait for you to see at conference, more about what we're providing in tools around radical alignment to the Great Commission. We'd love to meet you there. Erin and I will be there. She's going to be the MC. And we'd love to meet you there as our podcast listeners. So register at the URL intentionalchurchesconference.com. We'll see you next time. Thanks for listening.